by the time January 6th happened, we had just watched over a full year of violent protests in almost every major city in America. I live in a relatively small city, and every window on the ground floor of our Ohio State House was blown out. That building was closed and boarded up because of the violence that happened downtown in my own city. I mean, an entire neighborhood in Portland was literally taken over. Okay, I understand it wasn't the capital of the United States, and that's important, but an entire neighborhood, the police left. That is incredibly terrifying. That's scary and violent. And I think a lot of what led up to that is the same kind of stuff you're describing, which is a lack of mediating institutions and strong bonds outside of politics that led people to be fearful and angry enough to do something like that. So your insight that this has become our character is really important, because if we're going to try to solve it, we have to recognize the problem first. We can't pretend like it's not. So it's been a year since the riot at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Of course, we heard President Biden and Vice President Harris talk at length about it yesterday. It was all over the news yesterday, just people commemorating the year since this happened. I was reading through last night because I had to refresh my memory on some of the details of this, and specifically of the violence that happened there. There were, I think, 5 people that were reported that had been killed in the riot, but it turns out there was one woman who was killed when she was shot by a police officer trying to jump through a window into the Capitol building, I believe. There were other deaths, but they've since been attributed to other causes. It was thought for a while that one woman was trampled in a crowd, but it turned out she had tragically overdosed. And then there was another man who'd had a stroke. That was the Capitol Police officer who died later that day, and it turned out that he had had a stroke. So, I mean, it was a tragic day all around. There was, like I mentioned, deaths, but there was also violence, and the imagery was troubling for a lot of people. I think we were troubled as well by some of the religious imagery, people holding up signs that say Jesus saves and that sort of thing. And of course, the impetus of the gathering at the Capitol was this was a group of people that felt that the election had been stolen, and that, that something really terrible was happening. And it's not a good day. It was not a good thing to remember. And I think you had a really helpful commentary that day that we re-aired this week at breakpoint.org.
It was one of the last week of the year we air some of the most important or popular commentaries from the previous year. And so that was the week after Christmas. It was one of the commentaries that week. But we'll link to it again, because we went back and looked at it. I went back and looked at it hard. Our team looked at it hard. And, whenever you have an incident like that, there's always immediate reactions. Some of those reactions are based on, what video footage is. And there's always video footage that's left out in the telling of stories. And there's video footage that's emphasized and repeated in the telling of stories. And there's always details that emerge. And, what we've discovered, and I think most of us have, you can think, for example, about the story of the young men from Covington Catholic School at the March for Life several years ago was kind of a classic example. There was footage of a kid and a narrative, and everything seemed to match until additional footage came out, and then it all proved to be wrong. But in your telling of the story is right. I mean, the deaths that were reported, that story now has been nuanced pretty heavily, in the scale of the violence. Doesn't mean there wasn't violence. It also means, comparisons like the president and the vice president made to things like Pearl Harbor or 9/11 were just completely inappropriate, absolutely inappropriate. Capitol Police have told their version of the story, and it's awful. I mean, what they were expected to do. It was also awful that they were. There seems to be, just like 9/11, indications now that we had some heads up that something was going to happen, and Capitol Police simply were not prepared. That's something that has now emerged. So there's all kinds of different details that have emerged, and we went back and looked very carefully at that commentary. And I think there's additional things that you and I can talk about here, but some of the analysis that we brought to the day, and it was really the day after. I wrote that commentary as I was watching it, as literally as I was watching it that day, and I think it was aired the very next day. And I think it stands. I really do. It's not complete. It's not the whole story. It's certainly not the details. There's a whole lot more to be said about specific events that fed into it. For example, the election, the way the election went, whether or not the election results were legitimate, and all of those things that a lot of people will kind of point to. But it was a bad day, and it was a violent day, and it was there were a lot of things that were wrong about that day, including a group of people trying to encourage the vice president to do something that he should not do. The vice president made the right decision that day. Legal theorists and everyone else who just wanted kind of, here's a means to an end, as if the end justifies the means. That was a political side of this day, of this story, that needs to be carefully scrutinized as well.
I've seen some pieces and some people talking about the day, and I don't think we obviously can never excuse that kind of violence or the idea that a mob should take over the U.S. Capitol. But there can be charity given when we consider, like, we can sit back and say, some people legitimately believed that the election was stolen. Now, I agree that Mike Pence did the right thing. But when people really believed that, let's think about how that would motivate somebody to act. And I think this was a really good point that you made, which is we had reached such a fever pitch, and I think we're still there in a lot of ways, if not even beyond it, in our political world, in political life, where some people truly believe and feel that if politics goes a certain way, that we're doomed. Like, the country is doomed. If Donald Trump is president, we're all going to die. If Donald Trump is not president, we're all going to die. And you talked about this a little bit in your commentary, and we've talked about it among the team. This is the sort of thing where politics has sucked all of the air out of the room. It's the only thing we have left to hold on to. And that's the basis of the kind of fear that drives people to do something irrational, like storm the Capitol building.
So there's two or three analyses here that I think is most important. And I don't think you can see this day accurately. I do think there's details specifically about the day that have to be addressed. But I think that the most important subtext of what happened on January 6th a year ago is how this is another indicator in a larger story of our culture. And what you just said, I think, is one of the most important pieces that we have to understand. When politics takes over culture, it's not good for that culture. It's an indication that something is dramatically wrong, because everything about culture and a people's well-being rests in something that is at heart often just about grabbing and grasping power. This is not just the story of those on the right. It's the story of those on the left. And honestly, I think that was evidenced this week by inappropriate comparisons of January 6th to devastating events that were international and not just political events, but were very much clashes over cosmic level ideas that created bloodshed to the scale that we couldn't even imagine. For example, in the case of 9/11, I think it's also been evidenced in basically attempts just to continue to point to this day as some national mark in order to drive through political agenda items. And that's what we saw from the president and the vice president. I think it's a completely inappropriate thing to do. I really do. I think it reflects the same sort of kind of breathless hysteria that comes in a nation when everything rests on politics. Politics is not big enough to carry the weight of a culture. Politics is a lousy worldview. We did a commentary several months ago as we continued to reflect on the cultural moment, and that was one of them. Politics is part of a worldview. I fully disagree with those, and there was some voices just even over the last several weeks that advocated for Christians another kind of pietism, where basically we should stay out of politics, or we should avoid any form of nationalism, suggesting that sort of thing. This is not. I don't think a Christian worldview. It understates, for example, the emphasis that the Scripture puts on cultural responsibility. It understates, for example, this idea that we get specifically from the Apostle Paul, that God determines the times and places in which we live, and so our times and places are actually a part of our identity and part of our calling. I often go back to something Father Richard John Newhouse, who was the founder of the First Things Journal, and close collaborator with Chuck Colson on a number of initiatives. He said once in an article, he said, when I meet God, I expect to meet him as an American. And he got in a lot of trouble for saying that, as you could imagine, because people are like, are you saying that only Americans meet God? And he wasn't saying that, or, that being an American is somehow gives you, a key to meet God. And that's not it either. He was just saying, look, I didn't choose to be an American. But it's the time and place are part of my identity, and that is something about who we are. Another way to think about this, Maria, is Chuck Colson often would quote, and I think it was Bill Weichterman who was the first who said this, that politics is downstream from culture, which is almost always true. You could look at something like the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s and say, okay, well, that was upstream, and a lot of America wasn't ready for it. And in one sense, culture was upstream from that piece of legislation, and then that piece of legislation was upstream from other parts of the American culture. And so there is an interplay. There's no question between politics and culture. But what I'm seeing is that more and more and more and more of our culture is seen exclusively through political lenses. I mean, the politicization of literally everything, things that have no business being politicized, and I mean as intimately local as the dinner table. I can't be friends. I can't be neighbors with you if you don't see this in a particular way. That's when all the other aspects of life, and I don't mean individual life, I mean our lives together, which carry or should carry a lot of the weight. What Edmund Burke called the little platoons of society, the non-governmental mediating structures, how we arrange our lives together to care for each other, to build a culture. And I'm talking about families and churches and voluntary groups and various ways that we take care of ourselves. So we don't need the big state to overjump its sphere into our lives. That stuff is just so thin right now. And when that becomes so thin, then everything rests on politics. Everything rests on national politics. And this tells us, I think, perhaps one of the most important features of our society right now is that way too much weight is being put on politics, and incidents like this are flare-ups when we think everything's about to be lost. I think it also gives us a very clear calling. Especially for Christians who believe that God created more than the state. God created all these other aspects of our lives, and that we need to invest heavily in them.
It's not just dangerous in a socio-political way to put so much weight on politics. It's also irrational because it's not the way God designed the world. So that's how you get this sort of irrational behavior where you literally think, because in a world that, like you're describing, where the little platoons are strong and our mediating institutions are strong, and we find our safety and our well-being in units like family and church and community, where we're voluntarily committed to each other as opposed to politics, then when someone gets elected who you disagree with, and you could have grave concerns about the decisions they might make, and you could be well informed about how those decisions might affect your little platoons, you're still not going to imagine that they're the world is over, that somehow God is defeated and that his will can no longer be done. And that now, that something has happened that would justify some sort of violence or that sort of thing. You would never get there because your institutions are strong. I think that's what you're describing. And I think I think the other point that you made in your commentary that we re-aired was so important, that there were so many people, the common refrain was for people to look at the footage of January 6th and say something like, "This is not America. This is not our character." Sort of distancing from that sort of thing. And your response to that was, "What if it is?" And I think the receipts are there. And this was the other part of my personal frustration hearing, like you said, the comparisons to things like Pearl Harbor and 9/11 and whatever else, is that by the time January 6th happened, we had just watched over a full year of violent protests in almost every major city in America. I live in a relatively small city, and every window on the ground floor of our Ohio State House was blown out. That building was closed and boarded up because of the violence that happened downtown in my own city. I mean, an entire neighborhood in Portland was literally taken over. Okay, I understand it wasn't the capital of the United States, and that's important, but an entire neighborhood, the police left. That is incredibly terrifying. That's scary and violent. And I think a lot of what led up to that is the same kind of stuff you're describing, which is a lack of mediating institutions and strong bonds outside of politics that led people to be fearful and angry enough to do something like that. So your insight that this has become our character is really important, because if we're going to try to solve it, we have to recognize the problem first. We can't pretend like it's not an issue.
I was thinking this week about that, and thinking about something that you had written in a commentary near the end of the year about, this whole thing about, re-envisioning historical women who did great things. They must have been transgender because, women don't do those things, men don't.
Smart.
I mean, you remember that?
Yeah.
Right. And you had this line in there that I thought was really great, which was, this is a thing that women do because women did it.
We just watched a woman do it. So, yeah, you don't have to ask
and this is a
yourself.
completely different application of that kind of real basic, this ain't rocket surgery sort of math,
Right.
Which is, this isn't us, which was repeated over and over and over and over again. I understand when you put out aspirational lines in front of the American people at a time of crisis, asking them to rise up, asking them to get beyond
Sure.
A, B, or C, or D. But this was us.
Right.
And you're right. It wasn't just us that day. We watched us the entire year before. And
We've been becoming us for a long time at this point.
Well, this is us. We reported and analyzed statistics coming out of 2021 about the rise in crime rates, about the rise in opioid addictions. Biggest year ever for opioid overdose deaths. Who else
John,
did it?
I even think about things like we did a commentary last year about the crazy increase in family estrangements that we're hearing
Right.
about from psychologists and therapists, and that's part of this too, don't you think?
And I think it's tempting for people to say it's unrelated, and I don't think it is at all. This wasn't 9/11 where people clearly from the outside came in and did it. This isn't Pearl Harbor where people from the outside clearly came in and did it. This is self-grown chaos, and this is one chapter in a story that's becoming longer and longer and longer. And you say this isn't us only for two reasons, and both of them are not great analysis of the of whatever situation you're looking at in a case like this. First is if you're just being aspirational and you're just trying to point people back to some sort of moral framework, which I think some of the politicians we're trying to do. But that's kind of like, being the coach of a team that's down by 40 at halftime saying, we can still do this, guys. They can't. They just can't win. But what you're trying to do is to get them to not give up, sort of thing. So maybe tomorrow at practice you can start rebuilding and teach skills and whatever. I mean, that's kind of where it is. You can't lift people to quote C.S. Lewis, who don't have a chest, who don't have moral imagination, who struggle with virtue formation, who have a hard time thinking beyond the moment to the long, and think about long term. We're kind of a people addicted to immediate gratification, and call them to higher ideals. It's probably something we need. It's not a bad thing to do, but they don't have the capacity to do that, right? Because morality is not just something, and virtue is not just something you can put on like a helmet. It's a muscle. You have to work it out as an individual. People are going to be like, John, stop quoting Alexander Solzhenitsyn. But it keeps going back to when politics takes all the air out of the room and we put all the weight on this, you have to, at that point, draw the line between groups of people and say they're the good guys and we're the bad guys.
Yeah.
As if the line between good and evil runs between people groups. And we're doing that along purely political lines, as opposed to saying, look, God's understanding of who we are, how we should live together. We're going to talk later on in the program about, marriage and the way we're thinking about marriage. And again, our thinking that is becoming more and more apparently published about marriage and divorce proves, no, this is us. And we've got to take this hard look at ourselves. And that starts with the church, as Paul says, what is it? Let the judgment of God begin in the house of God. Look, we've got to turn around and look at ourselves first and foremost. Where are our loyalties? Where are our identities? Who do we belong to? What is true? And the ends justifies the means sort of thinking, which politics is. It's a pragmatic exercise at its heart. It's not something that's big enough to carry a culture, much less rebuild one. This is us. And I think that's why we look back over that commentary and said, I think it still stands because of this. Until we realize that, we need to just be repeating this to ourselves over and over and over.